We are concluding our series called In Good Faith, where we have been looking at the ways that we interact with one another and the calling that we have as Christians to this kind of higher way of living and thinking. And the sermon title, if we want to call it that, is Gratitude. We're thinking about gratitude. And in the midst of that, we are back in Psalm 24. We read the first half of this psalm last week. And this week we are concluding it with verses 7 through 10. This is the scripture this morning. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. And who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. And who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts, he is the King of glory. And so I think it is a great place to start. And Carol, one of the things that you've said kind of over and over this week when we were talking about gratitude is that, you know, what you're looking at and talking about, especially in reference to David, David is potentially writing this with the coming of the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem. And in the Jewish tradition, the Ark of the Covenant was the presence of God, right? And so he's celebrating the return or the presence of God back into the lives of the people, of being back around God again. And you said, you know, I think so often what we end up with when we come to a time of like Thanksgiving is toxic gratitude, right? This idea like you better be thankful or you better be grateful. And there's a juxtaposition there with the way that David is maybe expressing gratitude.
Yeah, for sure. So I thought a lot about how in this season, there's sort of a cramming down our throat of the idea of an attitude of gratitude. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've been at the Thanksgiving table and somebody says, we're going to go around and we're all going to tell what we're thankful for. And you know,
but then they're rude about it, and they're like, and you can't say your friends or your family or your job, so then you have to actually get deep?
Yes, yeah. I mean, and you may have come into that space. I mean, just candidly, if you're in a similar situation to me, someone may have been crying on the way over there. Someone may have only eaten rolls. It may not be the moment that you're feeling super grateful and wanting to get into that with your family, or it might just be that it's been a really hard year. I find that at the end of the year, here we are in the holiday season, starting with Thanksgiving and into Christmas, that sometimes that's when you start to do a little bit of a year in review. And for some of this was an amazing year, and it's easy for us to tell something that we're grateful for and rattle that off right away. But for some of us, this was a really, really hard year, and getting that out can be really difficult. And so I think as we talk about gratitude today, I want to nuance that. I want to make sure that it might not be a moment where you just feel extraordinarily grateful, but I do think that there is an awesome invitation here for us to notice and for us to look in the details. So when I read this passage, Christopher is right. He already mentioned that some scholars think that this was written to celebrate the return of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And so this was a super celebratory occasion because the way that I think of the Ark of the Covenant is that it represented God's presence. And so I imagine kind of this season for the Israelites where, you know, their heads are down, they feel like God isn't there. And then this symbol sort of comes into town, and all of a sudden the people are noticing again God's presence. Lift up your heads that the King of glory may come in. They're lifting up their heads. They're noticing. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit more today is what it looks like when we notice. And so Christopher and I had talked a little bit about gratitude journals. And so you shared something interesting. Tell about the gift and the gratitude journal and how that unfolded for you.
You think you share a story in confidence with the pastor, and then it ends up
coming out. No,
No.
It's not going to surprise anybody.
Well, I did give Carol permission to talk about it, so it's okay. One year, I can't remember if it was birthday or Christmas, but Caitlin had gotten me this gratitude journal. It's like a little green journal. You could carry it in your pocket. And she had just thought it would be like a nice kind of gift. And I need you all to know I am a great receiver of gifts. I never complain about them. I'm very thoughtful about it.
Caitlin
I
is
respond
laughing.
exactly as pastorally as you think that I would. I never make ugly comments for weeks afterwards if I don't like it. I'm very, very, very good at receiving gifts. You can tell my wife is nodding her head up and down, not left to right over there. And so as I received this gratitude journal, I did not receive it well. And I kept thinking, like, you just don't think I'm grateful? Like, what's it, like, you don't think I care about things? And after I got done complaining about it, I actually opened it up and I started trying to use it. And it had, lines for 3 things. You talk about that you were grateful for the day before. And then you kind of, at the end of the day, you write like the 3 things that you're grateful for at the end of the day. So a morning of gratitude and an evening of gratitude. And the journal lasted about 3 months. And part of what I noticed, especially, was that at first, when I was trying to fill this thing in, I didn't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have anything. I felt like I was stretching, trying to just find things maybe to be grateful for. But towards the end, what I realized was I was only wanting to be grateful for giant things,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we might, in the church world, call those big blessings.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't noticing the small things. It's like, oh, I'm grateful that, like, when my tire blew out on the highway, people stopped to help me. But towards the end, it's like, I'm grateful because my son, who no longer likes to be held anymore, crawled in my lap and smiled today.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think what happened was I began to be grateful for the little things,
Mm-hmm.
and I wasn't so focused on waiting for big things to happen. I began to notice and be grateful for the small, everyday, to use Christian words, miracles, right? The small, everyday little moments of gratitude.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I wanted Vaughn to sing the song that he sang this morning, because there's this one line that says, "The more that I look in the details, the more of your goodness I find." And so I've had some of these experiences recently, but it's interesting what Christopher is saying with the gratitude journal, because we started talking about it because we were at a conference a couple of months ago for clergy, and I was rooming with a clergy friend of mine who's a pastor at Christ UMC. And I've got to be honest that I was just not in a great mood about having to be at this conference. It was in Abilene. I was 3 hours away from my kids for 2 nights, and it just wasn't my favorite thing. And I was in kind of the worst mind frame the whole time. But I noticed that my pastor friend Kristen was in a great mind frame. And I'm like, why are you so cheerful? She was away from her kids too. And she said, I've been doing this gratitude journal. And I was like, I've been doing this gratitude journal. Like, I didn't really think that. I'm like, let me see it, And so,
Look, that reaction makes perfect sense to me.
Right. And she produced it and showed me these, how she started off her morning and how she was ending her day. And there was a major difference between how she was experiencing this conference and this time away from her kids and how I was experiencing it. And so I'll be honest, I haven't started a gratitude journal, but especially recently, I have been trying to look in the details, and you really do find an enormous amount of stuff there. So a couple of people have said, oh, I missed you last week, where were you? And I was supposed to be at a dance competition with my daughter. So my daughter's on a dance team, and she's only 6 years old, and it's pretty rigorous. Like, she does dance for 6 hours a week, and we have been practicing for 4 months. We had bought costumes, rented a hotel room, paid the conference fee, bought 16,000 bobby pins. I mean, just everything that you need for a dance competition. And she and I were so excited about getting to go to the Hilton Anatole for the weekend. And that Wednesday night, I got a text from the director of the dance team that said, emergency Zoom meeting, 7 o'clock. And so we got on the call and found out that at the same hotel that we were at, there was another group called the Jewish National Fund, or JNF, that was also staying there at the same time we were going to be there, which was all well and fine. Except for the fact that a pro-Palestinian group had decided to protest their presence at the hotel. And we found out from the Dallas Police Department that Dallas SWAT was going to be there. There were going to be armed guards at every door. The FBI was also going to be on the scene just to make sure they were managing the protest and there were no incidences. And so, very wisely, our dance director decided that this was not a place for 6-year-old girls, and so decided to pull our team out of the competition. And I have to tell you that my first thought, as Christopher said, sometimes you feel like as a pastor, you should always respond perfectly. My first thought was sadness over the fact that my daughter had worked so hard and wasn't going to get to do her competition. Frustration over all the money that we had spent that was going to waste. And then just the general idea of, why can't there be peace on earth? Why is our world like this? And so I felt really, really sad, but the weekend came all the same, and I had this very rare time because I had blocked off Friday night, all day Saturday. I'd taken vacation time on Sunday, and I had nothing to do. And our weekends are always filled with 17 million activities, birthday parties, cheerleading, voice lessons, choir conferences. I mean, you name it, we're going and we're doing, and it's packed. And all of a sudden, I had all of this space. And I found myself on Saturday, my daughter and I went to Hobby Lobby and just looked at all of the Christmas decor. I didn't feel frustrated as she pressed every single button to see what all the dancing toys did. And later that night, we went to my mom's, and normally I run into my mom's house and do the things that I need to do when we run out, but we stayed and we did a craft project, and then the next morning we had brunch and watched church online, and I got this major breath. And that Sunday night, as I was going to bed, I realized all of the details, the time that I gotten to spend with my family, the time that I had gotten to just take a breath. And all of a sudden, once I was able to see God in all of those places, gratitude just kind of poured out of me.
Yeah, I think all of us are struck by the fact that you could have been at the podcast last week, but I think that's besides the point. But no, I think you're exactly right, and I think the challenge is right. My 5th grade teacher had a sign on his wall that said, right, like attitude is a little thing that makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. And I think the challenge when we talk about, okay, well, an attitude of gratitude is we really don't know what that looks like. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes we think about it almost like toxic optimism, right? Like, oh, well, you should just be grateful for what you have, mm-hmm. right? And in reality, I think gratitude really ties into the word grace, mm-hmm. right? Grace is a free gift that is offered to us, but we have to decide to take it. Mm-hmm. Gratitude is an attitude of living in the world that we can have, mm-hmm. but we have to be willing to take it. There's a book Brother Lawrence wrote called The Practice of the Presence of God. And there's a lot of people who have taken some of that through the years and kind of adapted it in more modern times. And one of those adaptations is they say, God is in the dishes. Mm. So when you are doing the dishes, right, whether you are, scrubbing the plates or whatever it is, like God is in the dishes. And I have 3 children, so I tend to kind of disagree with that. But I understand the sentiment, which is if we're practicing the presence of God, then yes, God is in the dishes. God is also in the making of breakfast. God is also in the drive to and from fill-in-the-blank activity, right? Mm-hmm. If we're practicing the presence of God, then God is everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that David talks about so deeply in Psalm 24, right, in the beginning, he gives full credit to God. Mm-hmm. It would have been really easy for David, who was a shepherd, who is now a king, who is now an author, right, to have just said, like, I'm a self-made man. Mm-hmm. I did everything by myself. If you'd like to do everything by yourself too, here's my book, right? Like, let's roll with it. But he doesn't. Yeah. Right? He gives God all of the credit. And in the midst of that, where we end up today, right, it's, hey, God is here. Who mm-hmm. is the King of glory? Right here. The presence of God is coming. And if we acknowledge, like David, the presence of God in our lives, we begin to see God in everything. Mm-hmm. That's how you get into this, call it gratitude, call it an attitude of gratitude. It's not a toxic thing. It's a noticing of things. It's not a forced thing. Right. It's a learned thing. We have to really live into something in a new way. But there are times where it's really difficult, mm-hmm. times where everything seems to be going wrong, or you're just struggling with, fill in the blank, a mental health issue, or people in your life have passed away and you weren't ready for, right? There are times where you just feel like maybe there is no need for gratitude because nothing's going well or right. And I don't know what do you do when you reach that moment?
Yeah, I feel like I have struggled with this on and off since this summer. So I haven't talked just a ton about this because I candidly am still struggling with it. But this summer, a good friend of my daughter's, so my daughter and my family, we've taken our kids, both kids, to this same babysitter, and she watches about 5 other kids at the time. And so all of the families that go to, our babysitter's name is Miss Patty's, all of the kids that go to Miss Patty's house are just extremely close. They've been babies together, and we've gone to all of the birthday parties, done all of the baby showers when a mom gets pregnant, and so it's just a really tight-knit group. And this summer, one of those families was having a pool party, and one of my daughter's little friends, who is 4 years old, drowned. And the first funeral that I ended up doing as a pastor, as just getting commissioned in June, was for this 4-year-old little boy that I not only knew, but that I loved. And never in my wildest dreams did I think that I would be doing that so soon on in my career. I don't know what I thought. And I recognize that the grief that I feel and felt and feel over the situation is a grain of sand in a million-mile beach in the hurt and grief that his parents are suffering. But I have found myself many times asking myself, where are you, God? Where is the goodness in this? An innocent life, a little boy that barely had a chance to live, that was perfect, that had never done a wrong thing, and this sweet family that 1 second of an accident changed their entire lives. And so I have dug and I have spun, and there have been days where I've thought there's nothing to be grateful for here. But at this current moment, here's where I am on this. So I've thought a lot about where we see Jesus in the Bible showing up in the details. I've thought about how we see a woman that touches the hem of Jesus's robe, and it's just the hem. It's just a tiny detail, but Jesus felt it and healed her. And I think about how Jesus saw Zacchaeus up in the tree that day. He noticed him. That little bitty detail of that tiny guy up in a tree, he saw him. And he cared enough to go to his house with him and to spend time with him, and that changed Zacchaeus' life. In a million other ways, Jesus noticed that they were running out of wine at a wedding, and he fixed that. And Jesus noticed how his disciples were hungry after he returned and cooked them breakfast on the beach. Jesus was in so many little details. And so I've come around to the idea that the Jesus that was in those little details when he was on earth is still in the details now. And so when I think about this and I'm working through this and trying to figure out where God is, I notice God in the family that rallied around my friend. All of the friends, if you had seen it that day, the hallway was jam-packed from all the way down the Learning Center hall and all the way down to in front of the sanctuary with people that were there to tell them how much they loved them. And there was a ridiculous spread of food that day, and I see God there in the way that people just brought food to show their love and their acts of kindness. And so I think as I try to continue to work through this, like this big, really hard things, and all of us have this stuff, like this big, really hard stuff, and we are looking and finding, trying to find God, trying to find where we can be grateful for. Sometimes it's it's a small thing that you find. Sometimes it's a big thing. The love of family is not a minor thing, but it can be hard. And I think that's why we've talked about this so much, because we look in this passage and David is just in this celebratory moment. It's triumphant, it's happy. But I also think about these Israelites, hanging their heads and the idea of lift up your heads. And sometimes it takes a minute to lift up your head, but I do believe that in due time, Jesus will help you do that.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of it,
Yeah.
right? And the cultivating of gratitude in our lives helps us in those circumstances. The happiest people I know are the most grateful people.
Yeah.
The strongest, most fulfilled people I know
Yeah.
are grateful people. And part of that is they have cultivated finding that joy
That's right.
in the midst of circumstances. And I think that they know that ultimately God is going to provide and that there's going to be a victory and that they've got to trust in that. Paul, right, put it like this, right? Give thanks in all circumstances.
That's right.
For this is the will of God in Christ for you. And I've always thought about that because, we've all, I think, experienced it in some point in our lives, something tragic.
Yeah.
And when you read those words from Paul, after you've experienced something like you did this summer, you go, all right, when I see Paul,
Yeah.
tell me where to give thanks in this circumstance.
That's right.
But I also, I think about the kind of faith that it takes to move through moments like that.
Yeah.
The kind of attitude of life that it takes. And there's an old story of a hymn, and I've told it before, but it's always stuck with me because it's the only hymn that he ever wrote. But it's Horatio Spafford, and it comes out of tragedy. It comes out of tragedy, and when you read the words, you're like, you don't think like, what did this man go through? But he and his wife lost their young son to a fever. And then the Great Chicago Fire destroyed all of his real estate holdings and his property. They had planned a family trip to Europe for a vacation, but he got called away on business at the last minute. So he sent his family ahead. He said, I'll meet you there. During the voyage, a freighter broadsided the ship, and it sank. And in the midst of that, right, he received a letter from his wife that simply said, "Ship sunk, lone survivor." And so he gets on a boat to go meet his devastated wife. They have nothing left. And while they are traveling, while he is traveling, he pens the words to this hymn. It's one of my favorites. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. And I think the beauty of that is, right, we've now been in Psalms for 4 weeks. We watch David move to this place. In Psalm 22, he's suffering. He feels apart from the community. He feels separated from God. He actually feels like God has abandoned him and that he's alone. We've all been there.
Yeah.
But then the same David who felt alone in Psalm 22 writes Psalm 23, where he trusts God to lead him and guide him through the darkest valleys. Is the same God who then he celebrates in Psalm 24 of God is with us. Let us celebrate the return of God. Lift up your heads. We sorrow no more. It is well with my soul.